Good day. Before I begin on the substance of the topics which I'm going to discuss in this program, I want to turn briefly to certain comments which were made by President Zelensky of Ukraine over the course of a press conference he gave in Kiev with the visiting Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. Many people have been reading these comments as Zelensky's admission or confirmation that Ukraine's counteroffensive is underway. Now, it's been clear to me that the Ukraine launched its counteroffensive a week ago on Sunday. We're now in other words, in its, I think, 9th day. And there's no doubt at all that Ukraine has indeed been conducting a counteroffensive throughout this time. In fact, I was, I think, one of the very first people to say, not the first, but one of the very first people to say, when the big attacks happened on that Sunday, that this was in fact the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The numbers of units committed, I think it was 6 battalions of motorized infantry and 2 battalions of tanks. This was far too big a strike to be a reconnaissance in force or a probing attack or anything of that kind. It was clearly the start of the offensive. And I said so at the time. And of course, I think events have confirmed that that is indeed the case. Well, throughout that period, since that first attack was launched, Ukraine has preserved a kind of silence about this offensive until Zelensky was asked about it at this press conference with Trudeau. And these are his words. He says, counteroffensive and defensive actions are being taken in Ukraine. At what stage I will not disclose in detail. Now, many people are treating that as Zelensky's confirmation that Ukraine has launched its offensive. And after all, the offensive, as we see, is indeed underway. But I have to disagree with the analysis that some people are making of these comments. It's not a confirmation that the offensive is underway. In fact, if read properly, it's essentially an evasion, perhaps even a denial. It speaks of counteroffensive and defensive actions being taken in Ukraine. So that appears to refer to attacks in various directions, defenses in all sorts of directions. But he won't disclose in detail, and he won't say at what stage any of this is. So it leaves the question conveniently open. And this has been the game Ukraine has been playing now ever since the outset of these attacks. On the one hand, everybody can see, it's now widely reported in the media in the West that an offensive, the offensive, is indeed underway. But Ukraine won't confirm it, won't discuss it. They'll simply say, well, maybe there is an offensive, maybe there's not. We're conducting offensive operations in some areas, or rather counteroffensive operations in some areas. We're conducting defensive operations in other areas. We're not going to say what stage this is. This could be reconnaissance in force. This could be probing attacks. This could be any one of those things. But they're not coming out and saying straightforwardly and outright that an actual offensive is underway. Does this matter? Well, yes, it does. Because, of course, if this offensive fails, or if it fails to achieve any significant objectives, well, the Ukrainians can continue to string people along, pretending that the real offensive, the serious offensive, has not yet been launched, and saying that it can't really be launched until Ukraine gets more of the weapons that it needs, more F-16 fighter jets, more tanks, more infantry fighting vehicles, more shells, all that kind of thing. So this is a good case of Ukraine giving itself a get-out clause in case things go wrong. The fact that they are actually engaging in this kind of semantics, I think, shows how little confidence, by the way, they have in the prospects of this offensive. But anyway, they're engaging in this game because, of course, they don't want to be caught in the event that, as I said, it all goes wrong. They want to be able to say, well, actually, we didn't fully launch our offensive up to this point. Well, what is happening in this offensive, which is underway, even if Ukraine isn't admitting to that fact? Yesterday, I said that there was a lull because of the poor weather conditions, which was true for most of the front line, but it was not true in one particular area, which is called the ledge. Now, the rain, which was falling at that time, made the soil softer and more muddy. That did restrict the movement of armoured vehicles, and that does seem to have dissuaded the Ukrainians from launching attacks in various places. But they did attack this one place, the ledge, and from what I've been able to work out, they did so with relatively small forces, perhaps a couple of hundred men, number of armoured vehicles. Anyway, they drove onto this ledge, which, by the way, I was wrong yesterday when I said that it was to the west of most of the fighting, the big fighting that's been taking place over the last couple of days. It's actually to the east of it. It is, in fact, in the same general area as the area in which Ukraine launched its attack on the first day of its offensive, roughly 9 days ago. Anyway, Ukraine launched an attack on the ledge, and it used the rain as cover. At least that's how the Russians explain it. The rain made it difficult for Russian drones to operate. I can easily believe that. These are propeller-driven machines. They're probably not very good in difficult weather conditions, especially if there's high winds, and lots of rain falling. So the Russian drones weren't operating to the extent that they usually are. That meant that the Russians weren't able to spot Ukrainian movements early through the rain and the murk. It also made it more difficult for the Russian artillery to operate, and it also made it more difficult for the Russian helicopter gunships to fly and operate. Now, a lot of people will probably say that these are just excuses and rationalizations to explain away what happened. But I do think it's probably at least a fair measure of truth to this. I think that people underestimate the role the weather plays in war. I can remember that during the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia, for example, there were days when NATO air forces had to call off their bombing attacks precisely because of the rain. Now, that was then. Of course, things have moved on technologically since then, but still, overall, I do get the sense that especially machines that operate, airborne machines that operate with turboprop engines, propeller engines, helicopters and drones would probably have difficulty operating in difficult weather conditions. Anyway, the result was that the Ukrainians pushed through and they captured these 3 villages on the ledge, and there was the usual anguish in a few places in the Russian media, though nothing on the scale of the panics that I've seen on other occasions. And one should stress that the media outlets I'm talking about are all small, and they do not represent at all the general sentiment, as far as I can see, either amongst the Russian military or amongst the Russian public, or indeed the bulk of the Russian media. But anyway, within these limited, relatively small outlets. There was some concern, maybe concern rather than panic, some worries about what had happened. And there was a certain amount, rather muted, triumphalism in Ukraine and part of the Western media. I have to say that capture of these villages in an area that could be described as the grey zone, the contested area, well ahead, well north of the big Russian front lines, hardly seems to me to be great news, important news. I suspect that in earlier wars, when the reporting was not as intense as it is in this war, where one couldn't get the kind of granular detail that it is possible to do now, because, to say it frankly, of the exceptionally high standard of the war reporting we're receiving. Anyway, I suspect that in most wars, skirmishes of this kind over a few villages would have gone unnoticed. Now, it's important to say that these are villages which, yes, the Russians have controlled, but they are on the very far edge of the area that the Russians control, and they are well ahead of the Russian fortified lines, and I'm going to discuss those in a moment. And they were places which it was always assumed that the fighting would take place and which would be contested. And these villages or settlements, some of them are tiny. One of them, Valterson, was able to find somewhere a satellite picture of it. It's referred to as a village. Some places they've even talked about it as a town. It's actually about 4 buildings, all of which seem to form a single agricultural complex, a farm, if you like. Part, possibly, of this October state farm that the Russian Defense Ministry has been talking so much about, which perhaps, by the way, is the same farm that might have once operated the combine harvesters which the helicopter gunships destroyed on the first day, mistaking them for Leopard tanks. Anyway, all of these outlying villages and settlements are deserted. Some weeks ago, the Russians carried out a massive evacuation of people from the entire defense zone, and these minor villages would obviously have been amongst the places from which the people were evacuated, and the result is that they are deserted. There is nobody living there. And the Russians maintain small outposts in these villages. They have, or did maintain small outposts in these villages. There were a number of light infantry people there. The purpose of these villages and of this area, which has been contested, is precisely to keep track of what the Ukrainians are doing, to slow Ukrainian advances as the Ukrainians try to move on to the main fortified lines that the Russians have in the south, to inflict attrition on the Ukrainians in the very extensive minefields that the Russians have laid in precisely this area, but it's not part of the plan ultimately to hold on to this territory. There would be little logic in doing so when the major fortified lines are further south. It's basically to gain time, and also, as I said, to inflict attrition on the Ukrainian forces before they reach those fortified lines. So what happened was that under the cover of all this rain, this Ukrainian raiding force advanced, captured these 3 villages, appears to have occupied briefly a part of a or a bigger village called Makarovka. I'm not going to pretend that I am very familiar with the topography or the place names around here. And anyway, the Russians pulled back. Now, we're also told that this is referred to as the ledge, but it is in fact, from what I understand, these advances took place along an asphalt road, a paved road. Apparently, the fields were moist with the rainwater, making them soft. So again, the wheeled vehicles weren't able to operate along these fields. They basically said what happened was basically the Ukrainians drove up and were able to push the small number of Russian troops holding these villages out of them and occupy them and raise Ukrainian flags over some of them. And they were able to do that because with the drones unable to function and the helicopter gunships unable to carry out strikes, Russian artillery and air support has not been there on anything like the scale that was the case before. Well, apparently, over the last few hours, the rain has cleared. We now have sunlight again, and the very latest reports are that the Russians have carried out a counterattack in this area, that the helicopter gunships and the artillery are back in action, the drones are back at work, and apparently Makarovka has once again been recaptured by the Russians, and apparently their counterattack is continuing. Now, one can, I think, spend a huge amount of time talking about this ebb and flow of the fighting in this territory. But as I said, I think that this is perhaps a disproportionate exercise. As I said, these are small places. Despite what some people say, I doubt that they have any great strategic significance in terms of the overall battle. They're hardly the kind of places that you could turn into sort of fortifications. They're not like those fortified villages, in fact, small towns that encircled Bakhmut and which were to a great extent its suburbs, places like Paraskovievka and Ivanivska and Klesheyevka and all of those places. They were not, or Opitnoye, they were not fortified locations like this. They're small places, as I said, lightly guarded by Russian observers, and it's always been assumed that they would be contested. And as I said, it may very well be that the Russians have indeed pushed the Ukrainians out of Makarevka and now control it, and it's also possible that they will recapture all these other villages, or perhaps the fighting will conclude with the Ukrainians still in control of some of them. Supposedly, the Russians have an advantage in that I referenced this place as the ledge. There is apparently higher ground which the Russians occupy. I would say again, this is steppe land, and in other words, plains, prairie-like plains. I mean, high ground must be a relative term in this part of the world. We're hardly talking about mountains or anything of that kind, a mountain or hill barrier, but no doubt the ground is higher, and the Russians apparently occupy it. And this has enabled them to shell the Ukrainians who are in control of these villages, and perhaps the Russians will indeed recapture them. I will just add one further point about this particular fight, which is that it makes sense for the Ukrainians to try to take these villages, or so it seems to me, and to try to commit reserves to do so, because ultimately their objective is to force their way through until they reach the major Russian fortified lines. I don't think that it makes as much sense for the Russians to try to hold on to these villages indefinitely, because these villages, as I said, are located north of the Russian fortified lines. So whilst the Ukrainians may have no choice but to commit reserves and indeed to burn through their reserves in order to capture these villages, which is what they've been trying to do, I don't think that it makes sense for the Russians to do the same with their reserves. If these villages are indeed part of a buffer zone, as I would assume, then surely the Russians would want to hold their reserves back, to hold the big fortified lines to the south, rather than deplete them fighting these little battles over these villages with the Ukrainians, when they're not ultimately part of the major Russian defense system. Anyway, that's what I want to say about this fight. Elsewhere, on the Zaporozhye front, if I can call it that, yesterday was quieter, though there were some Ukrainian attacks in various places. It's very difficult for me, who's getting my information second and third hand, to get a sense of the exact course of the fighting. But anyway, there were attacks in a number of places. Ukrainian armoured vehicles were again committed to the fight. But whatever, in every other place, the Ukrainians were thrown back and made no ground at all. It was just in this one isolated place of the ledge that they occupied, temporarily or otherwise, these small villages. Anyway, it's important to say that it is not just in Zaporozhye and southern Donbass that this fighting is happening. Ukraine is also attacking in many other directions. And indeed, there is now a belief starting to take hold amongst some Russian officials, which is that the Ukrainians may be actually redirecting their offensive elsewhere. The offensive in Zaporozhye was not a great success, so it might make more sense for Ukraine to attack somewhere else, to redirect its forces somewhere else. And one of those officials is Yan Gagin, who is the advisor to Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, and he told TASS, currently the Ugledar and Avdiivka sectors are the most active and intense ones. Now, Ukrainian troops are considering precisely the Donetsk area as promising. The Ukrainian army has rather serious forces concentrated. They continue to accumulate personnel and equipment in that area. And Gagin hastened to say that all attacks by Ukrainian troops are being curtailed by Russian forces. Now, there is no doubt at all that these attacks are taking place, and certainly some of the attacks that Ukraine has been launching in the Bakhmut area, along what were once the flanks of the main advance, the Wagner organization's advance into Bakhmut, what were once the flanks, now I think they're better understood as part of the front lines. Anyway, some of these attacks have been fully comparable in scale to what has been happening on the Zaporozhye front. But so far, every one of these attacks, at least according to the Russians, and we have no contradictory information from Ukraine, all of these attacks have been repelled in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, where there's been intense fighting, as Gagin said, near Ugledar, and by the way, also further north, near Kupiansk. And I've seen recently a map which provides a close-up picture of the fighting in Kupiansk. it confirms the very close proximity of the Russian forces to Kupiansk, the Russian control of bridgeheads in and around the area of the Oskol River, the fact that the Russians are west of the Oskol River line. They are indeed very close to Kupiansk, and this must be a matter of great concern and importance to the Ukrainians, and it makes sense that they might be conducting attacks there. But anyway, for the moment, all of these attacks have been unsuccessful. And this perhaps is a case of Ukraine trying to repeat its success of last autumn. Last autumn, the word for months was that Ukraine was going to launch a big offensive to try in Kherson region with the objective of capturing Kherson city and destroying the Russian forces that were defending Kherson city. And indeed, right at the very end of August, Ukraine did indeed launch that offensive. And rather like this current offensive that we're now seeing in Zaporozhye region, the first days of that offensive went very badly for Ukraine. Ukraine suffered very heavy losses and didn't seem to be making any progress. But what had happened was that the Russians had obviously been alerted to Ukraine's preparations for this offensive. They deployed around 25,000 troops to the west bank of Kherson region, opposite the west bank of the Dnieper River. These are mainly airborne troops, as I've discussed many times. And these 25,000 troops came out of a Russian force in Ukraine that had become very severely depleted. Now, there's lots of discussions about the exact numbers of men that Russia had deployed in the conflict at that time. Perhaps the best number that I've seen is 80,000, which I think comes from Simplicius the Thinker. Anyway, there is no doubt at all that in the autumn of 2022, the Russians were very heavily outnumbered by Ukraine. And so 25,000 out of, say, 80,000, a very significant commitment. And the Russians, as a result, were juggling forces. They committed themselves to a big offensive near Donetsk city, where they captured the fortified village of Pesky. They were already starting to work towards taking the first steps of advancing towards Bakhmut. They didn't have enough troops to defend every part of the battlefront. And the result was that Kharkiv region, the Russian-controlled areas of Kharkiv region, and towns like Balakleya, Izium, and Kupiansk were desperately short of troops. I calculated that there might have been perhaps about 2,000 regular army troops from the Russian military in this area at the time when Ukraine launched its Kherson offensive. The balance of the forces defending Kharkiv region were second-line troops from the Donbass militia. I'm not sure how many of those there were, but anyway, those sorts of troops, and National Guards troops brought from Russia, who are not combat troops, but who instead fulfill a internal security role. So Ukraine seized the chance that the Russians committed to defending Kherson. They seized the chance and they launched this lightning offensive in Kharkiv region. And the Russians had made no preparations for this offensive. They'd not built any fortifications. They'd not laid any minefields. They'd taken no step to prepare for the defense of Kharkiv region. At the time, I wondered whether the Russians had already been planning to pull out of this area entirely. And I still think that might have been the case, but obviously I don't know for a fact. But anyway, one way or another, the Ukrainians were able to capture a large area of territory in Kharkiv region against a very limited Russian opposition, rather than try to fight and hold back the Ukrainians with the limited number of troops they had. The Russians chose to withdraw. Now, that was presented in the West and in Ukraine as a great victory, and in some respects it was a big psychological blow for the Russians. It also did restore to Ukraine some significant, at least in size terms, areas of territory, though it must be said sparsely populated areas of territory. None of these places, Izium, Kupiansk, is particularly big. But anyway, and of course Ukraine also did suffer very significant losses over this offensive. But anyway, it does make me wonder whether Ukraine might be thinking that it can do the same thing this time. And we've been seeing the Ukrainians launching these attacks all along the conflict line, perhaps looking for a similar point of weakness to the one in Kharkiv, and perhaps looking to break through. And perhaps the last card in the deck, if there is no real progress along the Donbass front lines, and I get the sense that there hasn't been, that the Russians have been more than capable of throwing back and repelling all Ukrainian attacks in Donbass. But there's still a possibility, maybe, that Ukraine will take the plunge and try to launch some kind of attack towards Belgorod city, which is in Russia's pre-2014 borders. Now, there are Russian troops there. I don't know the number, but there certainly are, and there are Russian forces covering Belgorod, and there have been attempts by Ukraine, as we know, to penetrate into Belgorod region, and all of these have so far been completely unsuccessful, but that doesn't mean that something similar might not happen. I saw only today that Ukraine has been shelling Belgorod region again. Apparently something like 30 shells were launched into Belgorod region over the course of the previous 24 hours. So it could be that that is what the Ukrainians are planning, that they're looking for some way to repeat the success of the autumn of 2022, the Kharkiv offensive. But whether that will happen with a much strengthened and much more heavily reinforced Russian army, I'm not able, of course, to say. Anyway, one effect, one consequence of these Ukrainian attacks on Belgorod is that it is making a lot of Russian men, especially from what I can see from the photographs, youngish men, decide to enlist in the Russian army. Now, some weeks ago, I think it was Dmitry Medvedev said that 117,000 men had volunteered to join the Russian army over the last couple of months. And yesterday, or I think it was yesterday, Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, said that in the last, that over a 2-week period, just over the last month, just over the last 2-week period, a further 13,500 had done so. And I can't help but think that that is connected to these attacks on Belgorod, that young Russians, patriotically minded Russians, I suspect some who have served in the military already, are feeling that the motherland is threatened and that it is their duty, their obligation, their moral obligation to come to its defense. Now, if we add 13,000 to 117,000, that's 130,000 men. I don't know how many of these will actually be incorporated in the Russian military. I suspect they will all have to undergo physical tests. And then, of course, all of these men will have to be trained, assuming that they're needed. But the Russian Defense Ministry is itself saying that it's receiving now so many volunteers that it doesn't actually need to carry out a further mobilization, because it's getting lots of men joining up, and that the Russian army itself, as a result, is growing in size. Now, I think this is not only almost certainly true, of course I can't again corroborate it, and I no doubt some people will say it's all propaganda and all that, but I not only think it is true, from my dealings with Russians, I find it entirely unsurprising. There is nothing more likely to provoke a political consolidation in Russia than an attack on the country, as they would see it. And I always thought that the Belgorod attack by Ukraine was a reckless mistake, and we're starting to see the consequences. But it's unlikely that Ukraine itself will learn that lesson. We'll probably see more attacks of that nature over the next couple of weeks and months. And I can't help but think that Ukraine will continue along this practice until this war finally ends. Anyway, that's one important and interesting piece of news, but there's been a lot going on as well, and that is in the air, because even whilst the fighting has been happening on the front lines, even whilst the Ukrainians have been launching attacks in Zaporozhye region and in Donbass and shelling Belgorod, and even as the Russians are, as I said, having this influx of volunteers, the Russians have also been carrying out more drone and missile strikes across Ukraine. And yesterday was a very big day of such drone and missile strikes. Missile strikes involving Calibre missiles and Geranium-2 drones and Calibre missiles launched by the Black Sea Fleet, Geranium-2 drones, and KH-101 subsonic cruise missiles launched from the Russian strategic bombers. And it's difficult, again, to give an exact picture of what the damage which has been done to Ukraine is, but one gets the sense that it's very extensive, and one also gets the sense that the attacks on Ukraine's military infrastructure are accelerating. And of course, that could have an impact on Ukraine's own ability to sustain the war. We don't know the exact state of Ukraine's arsenals, but its ammunition, its stocks of ammunition and equipment seem to be very depleted. As I said, I don't get the sense that the Ukrainian air defense system is operating significantly at all anymore. We just don't know exactly what all this is doing, but one does get the sense that it is doing quite a lot, and probably the extent to which it is doing damage is going to escalate, bearing in mind that as they try to conduct their offensive, Ukraine's ammunition usage is going to increase. Now, we've now had a comment from Peter Pellegrini, who is a former Slovak Prime Minister and leader of the Voice Social Democratic Party of Slovakia. He says arms depots have been drained across Europe. All armies will need to replenish supplies. This will take 5 to 10 years worth of work. And he says that he thinks that Slovakia will not be able to provide substantial military aid to Ukraine anymore due to lack of resources. And he also thinks, by the way, that the conflict might open up new opportunities for Slovakia's defense industry because it can produce munitions for Ukraine, providing Slovakia with income, jobs, and this is true. But ultimately, Ukraine, rather Slovakia, will not be able to do very much, and one gets the sense that the West collectively cannot do very much either. Now, I don't want to second guess the Russian General Staff, and what they're thinking, what kind of plans they're making. They must be looking at this situation, and they must be saying to themselves that Ukraine is fighting this war in a way that ultimately plays to Russia's advantage, because the Russians are increasing military production. I've seen pictures now of the batch of advanced Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers that have just been delivered to the Russian military. We've seen many more Russian weapons appearing on the scene. Anyway, the Russians, their military industries are now working flat out, producing more and more weapons, perhaps accelerating their tempos of weapons production. The Western powers, the Europeans, have severely depleted their arsenals. The United States, I discussed yesterday at great length that article in Politico that military experts, the military in the United States, the Pentagon, is becoming worried that the drain of resources is depleting US arsenals at a time when the US's industrial base is unable to replenish those arsenals quickly, and when the United States needs to focus instead on China rather than become distracted and bogged down in Ukraine. So, from a Russian point of view, they must be saying to themselves that the Ukrainians are doing things in ways that will ultimately work to Russia's advantage. They're burning up ammunition, they're burning up tanks and other machines, and every day more photographs appear of more Leopard 2 tanks and more Bradley infantry fighting vehicles smoking, knocked out in Ukraine. There's one particular article that appeared, I believe it was in Agence France Presse, in which a Ukrainian unit, a soldier from a Ukrainian unit, said that his unit, presumably a company, at the outset of its attack had 9 Bradleys, 6 got knocked out, and 3 were damaged but repairable, and of 6 were wrecked, 3 damaged but repairable, 1 was unscathed. So I could quite understand how that works, because that's 10 vehicles. But anyway, that's what he said to Agence France Presse. 9 vehicles attached to the group's mechanized infantry unit. 6 were wrecked, 3 damaged but repairable, and 1 was unscathed. So it does seem as if the Bradleys are not doing very well in this fighting up to now. And that, by the way, is roughly a tenth out of a single unit of the entire fleet of Bradleys that the United States delivered to Ukraine some months ago. Now, there might have been more deliveries which we've not been told about, but anyway, it does seem as if Ukraine is burning through its Bradleys and it's burning through its Leopard 2s. Now, there's been, as I said, an accumulation of photographs. I'm not able to keep up with the count of Leopard 2s that have been destroyed, or indeed of Bradleys that have been destroyed. As I think I've said in my previous video, it seems to me between a dozen and a score Leopard 2s destroyed. from the pictures. Perhaps I'm overestimating, I'm not sure, but so not by very much. And I get the sense that perhaps rather fewer Bradleys have been destroyed. But if you believe the numbers the West has given us, which is perhaps unwise, then there is already a very significant proportion of the total of Leopard 2s and Bradleys that have been supplied. If it's up to 20 Leopard 2s, then Ukraine has already lost around a third of its fleet of Leopard 2s. If the number lost is 20 and if the actual number supplied is only 60. But of course we don't have absolute confirmation of either number. Now, here I do want to make briefly and in parenthesis one particular point. There was a comment, a report from a Ukrainian Telegram channel called, I believe, Resident, which said that there's been a military conference in Kiev assessing the first days of the offensive, and allegedly Zelensky told the officials who were present, we're not told who these officials were, that there had been all kinds of initial probing attacks in the first half of this month, but the big blow is supposed to fall in the second half of June. So that the big attack that the Ukraine is going to launch is going to be launched later this month, that all that we have seen up to now have been probing attacks. Now, that may very well be the word that the Ukrainians are trying to spread. I said right at the start of this video that Zelensky's evasive comment about the offensive is not confirmation that the offensive is underway. It's an exercise in invasion. It's trying to pretend, sort of say, yes, maybe it is and maybe it's not, but I'm not going to say one way or the other. And it seems to me that this comment is of the same nature, because what we have seen over the last 9 days, is not by any stretch of the imagination probing attacks. One does not use one's best equipment for probing attacks or one's best trained troops, I would have thought. I mean, given that Ukraine probably does have only a finite number of Leopard 2 tanks and only a finite number of Bradleys, it would not be sending them into battle for just probing attacks. Clearly, what happened was that over the course of last week, Ukraine tried to break through. They tried to break through the grey zone. They tried to storm all their way to the big Russian fortified lines. They were probably expecting to be able to do that within a couple of hours. And they must have assumed that once they arrived at these big fortified lines, they would have their major armoured fist ready, and that would put them in a position to attack and to try and break through these huge fortified lines. As I said, you don't use your Leopard 2s and your Bradleys on just probing attacks. And it's important to stress this because it's quite clear that that plan failed. As the fighting has been restricted so far to the grey zone, the Ukrainians have underestimated the density of the Russian minefields. They've underestimated the ability of the Russians to survey the battlefield, the effectiveness of the Russian Air Force and artillery, and the steadfastness of the Russian infantry. So the result is that the plan has gone seriously askew. And we have now had some rather interesting discussions in the West about the scale of the Russian fortifications. Now, here I want to make a few further points because, as I said that the fighting up to now has been essentially conducted in the grey zone. There is ahead of the grey zone, or rather behind the grey zone, the outer crust of Russian defences. This is a lightly defended line with forward troops there. It's not heavily fortified, but it, if you like, provides the first line of defence. And that's located, well, it varies from place to place, but in some places it's up to 10 kilometres behind the grey zone. In other places it's closer to that. And then the big Russian fortified lines are somewhere to the south. And these are fortifications of an entirely different character. And we see the satellite pictures. There's been a long discussion and analysis of these fortified lines in the Daily Telegraph. And the Daily Telegraph speaks of these fortifications as almost impenetrable. And they are 30 kilometers deep in places. They're heavily layered. They have trenches and dragon's teeth and minefields and every conceivable contraption you can imagine intended to hold back an advancing army. And it seems to me that if you're going to have any chance of breaking through fortified lines of this density and sophistication and extent, then you need all your best tanks and all your infantry fighting vehicles and all your best troops, and you don't want them frittered away instead in the minefields, in the grey zone, or in battles over deserted villages. So that perhaps gives you the best idea of what has gone wrong with this offensive up to now. Now, there's been some discussion that Ukraine at some point might tire of this offensive and might give up on it. I don't believe that is going to happen. I got the distinct impression during the fighting in Kherson region last autumn that Ukraine was starting to have doubts about the purpose of the Kherson offensive. Now, let us compare the situation with that offensive with the offensive that's taking place now. I said that the first line, the first proper line of defense that the Russians have in Zaporozhye region is a kind of outer crust, a sort of relatively thin line behind which is, you know, the outer barrier before the Russians fall back to their major fortifications to the south. Now, in Kherson region, the Russians only had an outer thrust. There were no big fortifications on anything like the scale that we're seeing now. There were no such fortifications existing in Kherson region. No elaborate structures with dragon's teeth and massive minefields and tank traps and all those sort of things. In fact, one of the mysteries of the war, one of the strong indications for me, by the way, that when the Russians advanced into Ukraine in February and March of 2022, they were acting basically on political directives to try to bring the Ukrainians to the negotiating table as quickly as possible, rather than planning for a long war. One of the curious features about the fighting in Kherson region was that the Russians didn't actually plant vast minefields like they've done in Zaporozhye region. And yet, in spite of that, in spite of the fact that the Russian defences were much thinner and far less heavily fortified, the Ukrainians found it very, very difficult to break through in Kherson region. in fact, the one significant breakthrough they did achieve was one which they achieved in identical climatic conditions to the one which enabled them to capture those 3 villages on the ledge yesterday. There was an outbreak of rain, and that meant that Russian drones and helicopter gunships couldn't operate, and that enabled the Ukrainians to push south, send a column of 100 armored vehicles, as I remember, down the main road along the Dnieper River, trundling towards Kherson city, until, of course, they were actually blocked when they reached certain water obstacles which the Russians created. So they never achieved a complete breakthrough, but that was the closest to a breakthrough that they did ever achieve. And in the meantime, they suffered horrendous losses. And I got the impression that things were going so slowly and Ukrainian losses were so high that there was a debate going on in Kiev about whether this operation to capture Kherson city was really worthwhile. Kherson city is remote from the main centers of population in Ukraine. Kherson region is one of the poorest regions in Ukraine. Its population density is very low. It's not an important area for Ukraine to control. It does have some agricultural significance, but it was not essential for the viability of the rest of the Ukrainian state. And I did get the sense that there were some people who were saying in Kiev, this isn't worth it. We're losing too many men to achieve a limited objective. And what I remember happened was that Jake Sullivan came from the United States and he told Ukraine that you must resume the Kherson offensive, which is of course what they did. And subsequently General Surovikin appeared on the scene and he decided to abandon Kherson city anyway, for all the reasons I've discussed many times. Anyway, I think the same thing is going to happen with this offensive that Ukraine is conducting now. Even if there are discussions in Kiev about the logic of continuing with this offensive, if many people in Kiev are making the same kind of calculations that they may be making in Moscow, that the burn rate of tanks, armored vehicles, ammunition, and of course manpower is too great, and the gains are too small to justify continuing with an offensive like this. Even as some people are making those calculations, the political pressure from the West to keep this offensive going is going to ensure that it does. If there's any risk of backsliding in Kiev, expect further visits from Jake Sullivan or other US and British officials to bring the Ukrainians back into line. And in fact, we've been seeing now a whole series of commentaries starting to appear in the American media. And there's been comments, I believe these were in the New York Times. I read the article, but I'm afraid I've forgotten exactly which publication it was in. But we're now told that Ukraine must keep this offensive going. It must achieve success in this offensive. Success can even be counted in the form of incremental gains, whatever that means exactly. Provided there are some gains, provided there is some captured territory to show, this in itself is sufficient to justify continuing this offensive regardless and irrespective of the cost. And why is this the case? Well, yesterday I discussed at length the realists' objections to the conflict in Ukraine. I call them the realists, but perhaps more accurately, they should be called the China war advocates, as opposed to the Ukraine war advocates. I discussed how they were concerned that the United States is falling behind China in terms of its military build-up, that the United States no longer has the industrial base to compete head-on with China, and that these people are becoming worried, increasingly worried, that the administration is over-focused on Ukraine, is neglecting the real challenge, which is in the Far East, and is allowing US reserves to deplete, arsenals to deplete to dangerous levels, whilst taking its eye off the ball of what is happening in China and in the Pacific. So that was one side. But of course, the other side, the people who are pushing this offensive, this Ukrainian offensive, the neocons and people like this, they will not want to, they don't want something like that to happen. They don't want the entire Ukraine venture to be called off. They certainly don't want a situation where the whole situation just collapses in Ukraine and the United States is confronted with another Saigon moment just soon after the collapse in Afghanistan. So what these people are pushing for is some kind of escalation in Ukraine. Now, in our recent programs, Alex Christoforou and I have discussed the former NATO Secretary General's comments, Anders Fogh Rasmussen's comments about sending East European troops to Ukraine. And I said that this looked to me, we said to discuss that this looked to be the agenda, that if Ukraine's offensive fails, if the Russians retain all their positions, rather than accept a debacle, especially with the Russians now hardening their stance, talking about regime change in Kiev, with Putin talking about the territory known as Ukraine rather than as Ukraine as a state, with Putin, by the way, also saying in his last program, and this is a point, by the way, that John Helmer correctly identified, also saying that from this point on, it is the military who have been given carte blanche to decide the outcome of the war. In other words, the way the war was fought at the beginning by the Russians was the politicians, Putin himself, ultimately controlling what the military did, telling the military, we don't want you to go too fast because we still want to achieve some kind of negotiation with Ukraine. Putin has now basically said, we've given up on any of that. Now the military have been given carte blanche to fight this war as they wish. And if that means the final defeat of Ukraine and its end as a sovereign state, so be it. It was not what I wanted, but it is what has come about. That was an important point made by Putin. And as I said, John Helmer was absolutely correct to identify it. So with all of that, you can't just freeze this conflict anymore. A diplomatic negotiation with the Russians might not be viable. So if Ukraine can't win, if it can't defend itself, if you can't realistically find means to reverse the situation, the course of the war, militarily, what do? You send in troops. Firstly, European troops. Perhaps some people are hoping NATO troops as well. And this is why the offensive has to be kept going, because the one thing that has become absolutely clear over the last couple of days is that the East Europeans are extremely unenthusiastic about intervening in Ukraine in that way. The Estonian Prime Minister, Mrs. Kallas, has apparently come forward and said that Mr. Rasmussen's comments were entirely news to her. She had no idea that the Baltic states were expected to participate in this great Ukrainian venture in that kind of way. This is not something that she'd been asked about. And public opinions in polls in Poland appear to show an overwhelming majority of people in Poland strongly opposed to direct military intervention by Poland in Ukraine. But nonetheless, that appears to be the plan. As I understand it, as I can reconstruct it, the idea is this. Provided Ukraine can show some progress on the battlefields, you come to Vilnius, you accept in advance that you're not going to get all the NATO countries to agree to admit Ukraine into NATO anytime soon. So the idea is that you offer instead, you give Ukraine instead, security guarantees. Now, we're told that these security guarantees will be less than NATO's Article 5 commitment, so that will mean less than an obligation, if it is in fact an obligation. There's legal arguments about this, but I'm not going to go there today. An obligation to come to Ukraine's defense, for the whole of NATO to come to Ukraine's defense if it is again attacked. So it'll be less than that, but it will somehow be more than what was provided to Ukraine in the Budapest memorandum of all those years ago. So some kind of commitment to defend Ukraine. But the initial plan is that it will not be provided, or so it seems, directly by the United States. It will be provided by all of these East European states. Seems very strange. And the hope is that that will presumably be enough to intimidate and deter the Russians, and will then open the way to freeze the conflict, after which the plan is to rearm Ukraine to the highest possible degree. That seems to be the plan that the State Department is currently working with. Problem is, as I said, the East Europeans seem extremely unenthusiastic, and of course the question then arises, what if the Russians simply call the bluff and say, no, we're not prepared to recognize any security guarantees you give to Ukraine. We're going to see this thing through. We're going to continue this war until we've achieved victory, at least, perhaps not victory, but at least the objectives that we set out at the start of this special operation. We want the 4 regions to be recognized as part of Russia. We want demilitarization, denazification, regime change in effect in Kiev, and neutral status for Ukraine. And if there's going to be any security guarantees, we have to be a party to that too. And already some members of the Duma are saying that the 4 regions are not enough. There have to be more regions as well, Nikolaev and Odessa, for example. And there's already been public statements to this effect. What then? What do the neocons do if they find themselves, the State Department do, if they find themselves in that situation? Well, I don't know. There's some really frightening talk by people like Michael Rubin, whom I remember very well, by the way, from the days of the Clinton administration, talking about supplying Ukraine with tactical nuclear weapons. I hope that people come to their senses before we do anything as dangerous and reckless as that. But anyway, that seems to be the talk at the moment. We don't look too far ahead. We don't worry too much about what the Russians think. We never do that. We spend all of our time negotiating with each other. Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism recently did a superb article about this. We spend all our time talking and negotiating and agreeing with each other, and then we come and we present a plan to the Russians, and then we're astonished when the Russians say no, and we're not interested. But anyway, that seems to be the plan in Vilnius. But one can see that there are objections. The East Europeans are very uneasy. Some of them seem to be outright hostile. There's difficult elections coming up in Austria very soon and Slovakia. In Austria and Slovakia, it seems that parties that have spoken out against sanctions might perhaps come to power. There's talk that the new Austrian government might forge some kind of alliance with Prime Minister Orban of Hungary. Now, I'm not saying any of this is going to happen, but anyway, there's all this unease and doubt and worry. So, if you're going to have any prospect of success in achieving these things in Vilnius, you want to reassure people that actually things are not going so badly in Ukraine. In fact, they're going rather well, and that is why you need these incremental gains. And you need these incremental gains to get this plan off the ground, and that is why the offensive will continue, causing thousands of men to lose their lives, hundreds of machines to be destroyed. On the subject of thousands of men losing their lives, the British Ministry of Defence said that Shoigu is overstating Ukrainian losses, which is a curious thing. I mean, why would the British Ministry of Defence want to argue with Shoigu? They haven't done this kind of thing previously. But even that was quite qualified, because they said, almost certainly Shoigu is strongly overstating Ukrainian losses. People miss the qualification, and the qualification suggests that even the British aren't quite sure. Perhaps Ukrainian losses are indeed very high. And of course, the equipment losses are indisputable and speak for themselves, despite a heroic attempt by a so-called military expert on Sky News in Britain to pretend otherwise. But anyway, there we are. So one can understand, therefore, why the pressure to keep this offensive going is going to continue. And can I also say that there is another factor now in play, and it is a particularly disastrous one for Ukraine, because I said that there is now this battle going on over the course of this war between the realists, I call them realists, but as I said, China war advocates, if you like, against the neocons. And this is starting to look to me increasingly like a turf war. And that creates, of course, its own problems. Because, of course, the neocons know that if they lose this turf war, if the realists prevail, it won't just be the case that their Ukrainian venture will have failed. It's also their position in Washington that is going to start to come unstuck. They will be accused of having led the United States into this cul-de-sac, this disaster in Ukraine, and they will suffer, at the very least, or so they may fear, a significant loss of influence. And I'm afraid that as everyone who has participated in a bureaucratic turf war can confirm, and I'm sorry to say I'm a grizzled veteran of quite a few, beyond a certain point, they become the all-consuming concern of the participants. And using outside players like the Ukrainians as pawns is something that people who get caught up in a bureaucratic turf war will never hesitate to do. So for all of these reasons taken together, I'm afraid this offensive will continue to the bitter end, either until it achieves some success or some kind of success that the neocons can call a success as they press for their ideas of security guarantees, or until the last, I was going to say last Ukrainian, but let's say instead, until it ultimately, finally burns itself out. We have many, many more weeks of this battle still to go. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various channels. Locals, first and foremost. That's where our main community is located and where you can join me every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time for my live streams. So Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And don't forget also to check out our shops. We have a new range of magic mugs and other goods which you can find for yourself. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.